Okay, so today we're going to take a look at two new constructs within Python called loops and lists. And we have seen both of these in Scratch, so now we're going to get familiar with how to do it in Python. So loop is a generic term for programming a construct that repeats code until a given condition is met. Two types we're going to look at today. We have the for loop and we have the while loop. For loop is like in Scratch where you have repeat a certain number of times, and then while loop is kind of like the repeat until type of loop. So we'll start with the for loop. So here is the construct for a for loop. We're going to start by saying my string is equal to intro dot space programming. So this is going to be a string. And then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate on this string. In other words, we're going to go through the first letter and then the second letter and then the third letter and each letter, etc. So we say for s in my string. Now this is a variable that is keeping track of where you are in the string. In this case, each letter of the string. So it could be for s in my string, it could be for letter in my string, for some sort of a variable in my string. We often use just a single letter to kind of indicate it's a counter. We're basically counting our way through the string. So in this case, we're going to have for s in my string. Notice you have a colon at the end. And then we indent, we say print s. So what this is going to do, it's going to print an I, and then an N, and then a T, and then an R, an O, etc. So it's going to print those each out one at a time. So here is a slightly more complicated for loop. My string equals intro to programming, count equals 0, so we have a counter in this one. For letter in my string, so that's going to iterate over each letter in my string. It says if the letter, notice this is the same variable here as we had here, if the letter equals R, then print I found an R, and its position is count. So the very first letter, if you found an R, the very first one, it would be a count of 0. But then it's going to increment each time you run through your for loop. The count is going to increment by 1, and so you're going to be able to have like a counter that establishes where your R's are. So if I run this code, now I've got it here kind of color coded for you, but if you grab this text, copy it and drop it into Python, which I encourage you to do right now. Have a window open in Python while you're working alongside with me. Then if you run the code, you're going to see that R was not found, R was not found, R was not found. R was found in position 3. So the counter has built up to 3 when it found the first R. So let's look at our string I, 0, 1, 2, 3. So position 3 is where we found the R. Remember, we always index by starting with 0. Well, we started our counter at 0. That's why we did that. Okay, if you want to do a run through a loop a very specific number of times, like you did in Scratch, where you'd say repeat 7 times, you can use this little function range. And so I'll do the first one for you. I'll kind of copy that, and we'll drop it into Code Sculptor. And I'll say print range 5. Now, when I print it, first, a couple things to notice about it. First of all, it has generated a list. We'll talk about lists in just a second. And you know it's a list because it has square brackets on either sides, and there's commas in between each number. Also notice it said print range 5. Notice it starts at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it stops at the number before 5. However, if you think about how many times you could iterate over this, you're going to go iterate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's still, by having range 5, it means you're going to do an operation 5 times. It just means that the counter is going to start at 0 and end at 4. If you go back over here though, and I want you to run these on your own, pause the video, run these, and see what kind of output you get by changing it from 0, 6. And then 1, 10, 2. What does that 2 do? And then run here. Here's a little bit of code that actually uses a for I in range. Now I is a typical little counter that says I'm counting over a bunch of numbers or a bunch of integers. So for I in range, I is a little variable, print 3 to the I, the power is, and then 3 star star I. That'll actually calculate the square and then the cubed and then the fourth and then all of those things. So let me run through that code. So go ahead and do that and then bring the output and drop it into your notes section. Okay, moving on ahead. That's the for loop. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the while loop. While statements includes code given with while a condition is met. So this is sort of like the repeat until some condition is met. So it's kind of a combination of a for loop and an if loop at the same time. One of the dangers of a while loop is that you could get stuck in an infinite loop if the condition is never met. So I'll show you an example of that. But let's start with a good example. So we have my variable equals 1. While my variable is less than 8, print my variable. And then we're going to increment my variable by 1. So if I run this code, oops, I didn't mean to do that. If I grab this code, wow, select the code, copy the code, paste the code into Code Sculptor, and I run it. Then what you see is while variable is less than 8, it prints it. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 is less than 8, so it gets run. But once you get to 8, it's not less than 8, so it stops. So that's a great way to run some if conditional type of code a certain number of times. Now, this is where you have to be careful of an infinite loop. So check this out. If I grab this text, this is very similar to the text we had before, except this time the incrementing is taking away 1 every time. So if my variable is not increasing, it's always going to be less than 10. So let's run this and see what Code Sculptor does while it's running. 1, 1000, 2, 1000, 3, 1000. So it got a couple of seconds, 3 or 4 seconds, before it finally said, uh-oh, you're in an infinite loop. Now, Code Sculptor is smart enough to realize when you get an infinite loop, and it gives you this time limit error. So when you get that error, you know there's something wrong with your while conditional. What's interesting is if I run this thing again, so notice it's at minus 3000. It got down to 3000. If I run it again, let's see if it gets the same value or close. Still running, still running, still running. 3029. So this number is going to vary just depending on the processing and what your computer is doing at the time. Okay, if you are doing Python and you're not in Code Sculptor but in some other platform, typically you'll do a Control-C if you've run your code and you're stuck in an infinite loop. You got to get out of the loop. So that's just something you can keep in the back of your mind if you're ever programming on your terminal or some other Python programming platform. Okay, a couple other things. You can use these for loops or while loops is the the break and the continue statement. So while loops can work with conditionals that have different options for exiting the loop. A break statement is executed if the first block terminates the loop without executing the else. So I'll show you an example. And then a continue statement allows you to skip the rest of the block and goes back to testing. So we've got examples for each of those. Here we go. So here's the first one. My variable is 1. While my variable is less than 10, so we're going to go through this. We're going to increment because there's a counter in here. My variable plus equals 1. We're going to go 1 and then 2 and then 3, and we're going to see, is it even or is it odd? Okay, so if it's even, it's going to print my variable as even. But if my variable is equal to 7, it's going to quit. It's going to stop working. So it says point breakout now, break, and that means exit exit this particular piece of code. It's like exit script in Scratch. So let's run it. You'll run it also, and you'll put into your notes what the code output looks like. Let's run it together though. Run. When it's even, odd, even, odd, even, odd, even, breakout now. So we got to 6 is even, and that was the last one. Then when we got to 7, it said, you better stop. So breakout, and it breaks, and so that it exits through that particular chunk of code. Okay, here's an example of continue. We'll say my string equals programming. 4-letter in my string. If the letter is I, then just keep going. But if it's not, then print the letter. So continue means just skip whatever's coming next and go back to your for loop and keep incrementing. So let's run this. So what you see, but I had print letter comma, so it goes P and then R and then O, G, A, M, M. But then when it gets to the I, it doesn't do that behavior. It doesn't do the print letter. It just goes back to the for loop. So if for something you want to go through a certain a certain repetition, but one of them you want to avoid or a couple you want to avoid, then you can do a little continue. So that works as well. All right, so here's an example of how you could use a loop to design a simple game. I'm going to let you play with that. Not when I'm talking to you. You can pause the video, run the code, and see what happens. So you can play around with that, but here's some sample code that you could use in a game that you might be creating later. Okay, let's move on. Lists. Lists are really powerful. Python includes several compound data types which group together numerous values. Lists are the most common and versatile. So all a list is, it's a whole bunch of values that are comma separated. I'm calling them items because they might be numbers, they might be strings, they might be all kinds of things. So a list of items need not all have the same type. So my list could have 1, which is an integer. It could have cat, a string. It could have a float, and it could have a Boolean. All of those things. So run this code and see what kind of output you get. If we want to, we can turn things into lists with the list method. So if you have a string, for example, computer, so we'd say print list computer, it'll take whatever's inside your parentheses here, and because it's in quotes, it knows it's a string, and it will convert it into a list of those things with each letter being a string. So that's kind of clever. You can also index this. So you could say list computer of 2. So go ahead and run that and see what kind of output you get. Okay, so lists are really powerful. You can add to lists, you can take away from lists, you can substitute numbers in lists or letters, you can get rid of things. So here are all of the methods, not all, there's many of them. Here are many that are most useful that allows you to play around with lists. So for example, you're going to just work through this code and you're going to see what each one of these does. So start in your code sculptor with my list equals this. My list equals A, B, C, D. So it's a list of strings, each separated by a comma. Notice you have a square bracket on either side of a list. That's how you define a list. Now I'm going to append. So I'm going to append and let's see, I'm sorry. First I'm going to find the index, my list sub 2. So let's do that. So I'm going to say my list of 2, and then I'm going to run this code. So this is how I suggest you do it. You just copy this, stick it in here, and then run it, and see what you get. Oops. Oh, that's weird. Yeah, when you copy quotes over, sometimes it makes some curly quotes, and Code Sculptor doesn't like curly quotes, so you got to just re-enter them. Okay, there we go, my list. So notice what happened here. You started with A, B, C, D, and then my list 2 equals H. What you just did is you substituted the value that was at 2, which is 0, 1, 2, the C. The C was at index 2, and you put in H instead. And so that's one way of replacing something that's in a list with a different item. So we have A, B, H, D, okay? So now I want you to go through each of these and figure out what each of these does. So append, what happens when you append, so just copy and then put it on your next line of Code Sculptor code and run it and see what append does. And then see what happens with you do append dog or versus extend dog, so run each of those. Insert, if you want to stick something inside a list somewhere. The 0 is going to represent where in the index you want that to go. And then try removing things. There's 2 different ways to remove items from a list. So play with each of those and see how they're different. And then I have a question for you. How are remove and pop different when we use one versus the other? So play around with these and then go ahead and fill in your answer. And when you've done that, you are done with your notes. Move on to your lab.